This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. An Oklahoma prisoner who was supposed to be executed Tuesday night died instead of a massive heart attack after his lethal injection was botched. Clayton Lockett was injected with an untested cocktail of lethal drugs. After struggling violently on the gurney, doctors halted the killing 13 minutes in when discovering Lockett was still conscious and trying to speak. Doctors say he suffered a ruptured vein, interrupting the flow of the lethal drugs. About 30 minutes after that point, Lockett died of a heart attack when the drugs had spread through his body. Oklahoma Department of Corrections Director Robert Patton described what happened.
As those that were inside witnessed, it was determined that he was sedated at approximately 7 minutes into the execution. At that time, we began pushing the second and third drugs in the protocol. There was some concern at that time that the drugs were not having the effect, so the doctor observed the line and determined that the line had blown. After conferring with the warden, and unknown how much drugs had went into him, it was my decision at that time to stop the execution. I notified the Attorney General's office, the Governor's office, of my intent to stop the execution and requested a stay for 14 days for the second execution scheduled this afternoon. At approximately 7:06 hours, inmate suffered what appears to be a massive heart attack and passed away.
Oklahoma Department of Corrections Director Robert Patton. The botched killing of Clayton Lockett forced officials to cancel the execution of another prisoner, Charles Warner. Both Lockett and Warner were convicted of murder. They each won a stay of execution earlier this month after challenging the secrecy of their execution drugs. But the Oklahoma Supreme Court reversed the decision last week after Oklahoma Governor Mary Fallin objected and state lawmakers threatened their removal from the bench. Warner's execution has now been delayed for 14 days, pending a review of execution procedures.
Clayton Lockett's execution was the second one botched this year in the United States. In January, an Ohio prisoner named Dennis McGuire was executed using an untested two-drug method. He made snorting and gasping sounds before he died, prompting his family to file a civil rights lawsuit and a call for a death penalty moratorium. Tuesday was the first time since 1937 that two men were set to be executed on the same day in Oklahoma since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, although it's happened in other states. The last double execution was in Texas in 2000. For more, we go directly to Tulsa via Democracy Now! Video stream, where we're joined by Ziva Brandstetter. She's the enterprise editor at the Tulsa World. She was one of 12 media witnesses to attend the botched execution Tuesday at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Ziva, I understand this is just hours after you've experienced what has to be extremely upsetting. And I was wondering, as you wrote up this minute-by-minute account of what you saw, could you start at the beginning, even before the execution began, what you heard in the prison as you walked to the execution chamber?
Well, typically inmates will bang on their cells before an execution for most inmates who are being executed, unless it's an inmate that none of the other inmates like. And so we heard a lot of clanging and banging on the cell doors before we were led into the execution chambers.
And then describe what happened once you got to the execution chamber, and set the scene for us, where you are, where the prisoner who's about to be executed is, how you can see him.
Yes, so the prisoner is in a separate room. The blinds are drawn. We're in a room that has sound microphone connection to the execution chamber. We're in a viewing room. There's 2 rows of metal folding chairs. We are in the back row. There's a dozen media witnesses, 2 defense attorneys in the front row, and then the rest of the seats in front of us are filled up by state law enforcement officials, Department of Corrections officials, those types of folks. Behind us, there's a small room with a one-way viewing glass where the victims' families, relatives sit. So we were seated. We were ready for the execution to begin. It began at 6:23, which is later than the other 3 executions I've witnessed. We were wondering why it took a while to start.
And Ziva, at some point during the execution, they closed the blinds, even for the media witnesses. Is that right?
That's correct. So what happened is at 6:23, the execution began. The inmate had no last words. About 10 minutes later, they pronounced him unconscious. There was no reaction for about 3 minutes, and then at about 3, I would say 3 minutes after that, he began a very violent reaction. He began writhing, lifting his shoulders up off the gurney and his head up off the gurney. He was clenching his jaw, exhaling. He was mumbling phrases that none of us could really hear. The only audible word we could hear was him saying, "Man." He appeared to be in pain, but we couldn't understand what he was saying. This lasted for about 3 minutes. The physician in the execution chamber went over, lifted up the sheet, looked at his right arm. The warden of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, who was also in the execution chamber, said that they were going to have to temporarily close the blinds, and after that, they never reopened them.
I don't understand. You were witnesses. Why did they close the blinds?
Their policies allow them to do that. I haven't had time to check in detail exactly what else the policies say. Clearly something had gone wrong with the execution. My understanding, we were told later that it was a vein issue with the inmate, and we don't know what happened after that. That's part of the story that we're going to try to find out.
Well, apparently the director of the Department of Corrections, Robert Patton, said that his veins, quote, exploded during the botched execution. Could you talk about, Ziva, the cocktail of drugs that was used in this execution that was apparently untested?
They used a 3-drug cocktail of midazolam, which is a sedative, vancurium bromide, which is a paralytic that's intended to stop breathing, and potassium chloride, which is intended to stop the heart. The first drug was the new drug for Oklahoma. They used 50 milligrams of that drug in each arm. It's my understanding that Florida uses that same combination, but midazolam in a much higher quantity than Oklahoma used.